Welcome back to Chapter 2 of The Origins of the Silk Road, the Fabric of Commerce. Tonight we're walking through the imperial workshops of 6th century Constantinople, where Emperor Justinian ran his fingers across silk that seemed to hold captured moonlight. Not the romantic merchant highways of legend, but the harsh reality beneath those shimmering threads. Just a story of imperial dependency, strategic vulnerability, and the discovery that the world's most precious secrets could be carried in a hollow walking stick. If you find peace and rest in these tales of ancient luxury and forbidden knowledge, I'd appreciate a like and subscribe. Drop a comment about what time it is where you are. There's something wonderful about knowing we're all scattered across the globe, finding connection through these threads of history that still bind us together. So dim the lights and relax. Let's begin with an emperor who commanded the Mediterranean, yet remained utterly dependent on his enemies for the one thing that made power visible: silk itself. Chapter 2. The Fabric of Commerce: Silk, Spices, and Luxury Goods. In the imperial workshops of Constantinople, in the year 550 of the Common Era, Emperor Justinian I ran his fingers across a bolt of silk so fine it seemed to hold captured moonlight. The fabric had traveled thousands of miles from distant China, passed through countless hands, and cost his treasury a fortune in gold coins that would never return to Byzantine coffers. Each thread represented not just luxury, but dependency, a weakness that gnawed at the emperor's strategic mind. The silk workshops within the royal palace precincts hummed with quiet activity. Master weavers, their hands stained with precious dyes imported from India and Persia, worked at looms that had been carefully copied from fragmentary descriptions brought by merchants who had glimpsed such devices in distant lands. But these Byzantine artisans could only work with silk thread that others had created, following secrets they could never fully grasp. The empire that commanded the Mediterranean, that had reconquered much of the old Roman territories, remained utterly dependent on its enemies for this most precious of materials. Yet silk did not travel these ancient routes alone. Peppercorns, small and black, once worth their weight in silver, found their way to Roman kitchens, where they transformed simple meals into exotic feasts. Each tiny sphere carried fire on the tongue, a heat that awakened the senses and spoke of distant tropical shores. Cinnamon arrived in curled bark scrolls, releasing its sweet fragrance when burned in temples as sacred smoke. The scent alone could transport worshippers to thoughts of paradise, while the spice itself preserved foods and flavored wines throughout the Mediterranean world. Saffron traveled as delicate threads, golden and precious as spun sunlight. These tiny stigmas, hand-picked from countless crocus flowers in the fields of Kashmir and Spain, stained both food and cloth with their rare color. A pinch of saffron could turn plain rice into a dish fit for emperors, while larger quantities created the golden robes that marked the highest ranks of Byzantine nobility. The labor required to harvest saffron, plucking 3 stigmas from each flower, requiring thousands of blossoms for a single ounce, made it more valuable than gold in many markets. These spices were not mere trade items catalogued by weight and measure. They were perfumes that scented palace halls and humble homes alike. Medicines that promised healing for ailments from indigestion to melancholy. Luxuries that linked distant worlds through shared desires for flavor, fragrance, and the exotic touch of far-off lands. A Roman matron grinding pepper for her evening meal participated in the same commercial network that brought silk to Chinese emperors and incense to Arabian temples. Silk was not merely valuable, It was transformative. A single silk garment could elevate a provincial governor to royal dignity, could serve as currency in distant lands, could seal treaties between empires. The emperor understood that control of silk meant control of luxury itself, and luxury was power made visible. On this particular morning, 2 Nestorian monks approached the imperial presence with quiet confidence. Their robes were simple, travel-worn, marked by years of missionary work in the far reaches of Asia. They had recently returned from Serinda, the land of the Silk people, where they had served in Christian communities that had somehow taken root in the heart of Chinese territory. What they carried was not gold or spices, but knowledge, and a proposition that would change the world. "Your Majesty," the elder monk spoke in carefully measured Greek, "we have lived among the Syries for many years. We have seen their gardens, worked in their monasteries, observed their ways." His eyes met the emperor's directly. "The secret of silk is not as mysterious as they would have the world believe. It comes from small worms, no more magical than the caterpillars that eat our cabbages. We have seen the entire process, from the mulberry leaves they consume to the cocoons they spin, from the boiling water that softens these cocoons to the careful reeling that produces the thread." Justinian leaned forward. This was not the first time merchants or travelers had claimed knowledge of Chinese silk-making, but something in these monks' manner suggested deeper understanding. "And what do you propose?" "That we return to China," the second monk replied. "Not as merchants who are watched and restricted, but as religious pilgrims who move freely among the monasteries. The Chinese Christians know us, trust us. We can observe the process more carefully, and perhaps," he paused meaningfully, "we can bring back more than mere observations." The emperor's advisors exchanged glances. For centuries, the Chinese had guarded their silk monopoly with the vigilance of kings. Imperial decrees sentenced to death anyone who revealed the secrets of sericulture to foreigners. This was a secret guarded for nearly 3,000 years, defended with more care than royal treasuries or sacred temples. Yet these monks spoke with the calm assurance of men who had found a way. What Justinian could not have known, as he contemplated this audacious proposal, was that similar conversations were taking place in palaces and monasteries across Eurasia. The appetite for silk had grown far beyond its origins, creating a vast network of desire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. In Rome, senators wore silk togas despite periodic legislative attempts to ban such decadent Oriental luxury. In Persia, Sassanid kings wrapped themselves in silk that had been rewoven with their own imperial patterns. In India, Buddhist monasteries created silk banners for religious ceremonies, while Hindu temples displayed silk offerings to their deities. And so begins our journey into the heart of commerce itself, the story of how silk transformed from a carefully guarded Chinese secret into the foundation of global luxury trade. The story of silk begins not with emperors or merchants, but with a young Chinese empress whose name has become legend. Around the year 2700 before the Common Era, according to Chinese tradition, Empress Leizu sat in her garden pavilion, sipping tea beneath a mulberry tree. The afternoon light filtered through the leaves above her, dappling the surface of her porcelain cup with moving shadows. A silkworm cocoon fell from the branches into her tea, and as she lifted it out, she noticed that the hot liquid had softened the cocoon's surface. The texture had changed from hard to yielding, from opaque to translucent. Curious, she began to unwind it, discovering a single continuous thread of remarkable strength and beauty. Whether this story reflects historical truth or represents a mythological explanation for humanity's oldest biotechnology, archaeological evidence confirms that silk production emerged in China by at least 3,600 years before the Common Era. Excavations at Hemudu in Zhejiang province have revealed Neolithic tools specifically designed for silk production. Scrapers for cocoon processing, their edges worn smooth by countless uses. Spindle whorls for thread production, perfectly balanced for drawing out the finest fibers. Primitive looms for weaving, their wooden frames still bearing the marks of ancient craftsmen. The site of Qianshanyang, also in Zhejiang, has yielded fragments of actual silk fabric dating to approximately 2,700 years before the Common Era. These ancient textiles, preserved by remarkable fortune, confirm that the legendary Empress Lezu's discovery reflects genuine antiquity. These early silk artifacts reveal a sophisticated understanding of sericulture that must have developed over many generations. The silkworms used were not wild varieties but domesticated Bombyx mori. These creatures had become so thoroughly adapted to human care that they could no longer survive independently. Their wings had grown too weak for flight. Their instincts had been shaped entirely around the rhythm of human tending. The mulberry trees that fed them showed signs of careful cultivation and breeding for leaves of optimal nutritional value. The tools for processing cocoons were precisely crafted for their specific tasks, suggesting established techniques passed down through master-apprentice relationships. The ancient Chinese recognized silk's extraordinary properties almost immediately. Unlike wool, which was warm but heavy, or linen, which was light but coarse, silk combined exceptional strength with gossamer lightness. A silk thread, though finer than human hair, could support a weight many times its own mass. Silk fabric could be woven so tightly that it turned aside arrows, yet so loosely that it floated like morning mist. It accepted dyes with a brilliance that made colors seem to glow from within. Deep crimsons like pooled wine, blues as profound as midnight sky, golds that caught candlelight and held it. The surface of silk reflected light with a lustrous sheen that no other material could match, creating fabrics that seemed to shimmer with inner life. Perhaps most remarkably, silk possessed what we might call democratic versatility. The same raw material could be woven into peasant work clothes or imperial ceremonial robes, depending entirely on the skill of the craftsperson and the fineness of the weave. This meant that silk production could be scaled from household industry to imperial workshop. It could serve local needs or global markets. It could represent practical necessity or ultimate luxury, sometimes simultaneously. The Chinese imperial court quickly understood silk's potential for projecting power and status. By the time of the Shang dynasty, roughly 3,000 years ago, silk production had become a royal monopoly. Tombs from this period, particularly those excavated in Hubei province, dating from the 4th and 3rd centuries before the Common Era, contain silk garments of breathtaking sophistication. Brocades with complex patterns that seem to tell stories in thread. Gauzes so fine they seem transparent, like captured morning fog. Embroidered robes that required months of skilled labor to complete, each stitch placed with the precision of a master calligrapher. The imperial workshops established during the Han Dynasty represented perhaps the most advanced textile manufacturing system the world had yet seen. Master weavers worked in halls filled with the gentle sound of shuttles moving through warps. Their skills had been passed down through generations of guild families. They worked with silk thread so fine that a single garment might contain millions of individual fibers. These artisans developed techniques for creating silk fabrics with patterns of extraordinary complexity. Dragons that seemed to move across the surface as the viewer shifted position. Flowers that appeared three-dimensional, as if they might release their fragrance into the air. Geometric designs that played tricks with the eye through careful manipulation of thread tension and dyeing. The Chinese government's determination to maintain their silk monopoly grew from practical economic calculation. Raw silk and silk products represented the most valuable exports in the ancient world. A single bolt of the finest Chinese silk could purchase several horses. It could buy a year's supply of grain for a small town. It could provide enough precious metals to mint hundreds of coins. These were prices that could finance armies, build cities, or purchase entire kingdoms worth of imports. The imperial workshops became centers of innovation and artistry. Women worked at great wooden looms, their fingers moving with practiced precision as they guided threads through complex patterns. The sound of their work filled the halls. The gentle click of shuttles, the whisper of silk against silk, the quiet murmur of voices discussing techniques and designs. Master dyers worked with substances gathered from across the known world. Cochineal insects from distant lands provided the deepest reds. Indigo from special plants created blues that seemed to hold pieces of sky. Saffron threads, worth more than their weight in gold, created yellow so brilliant they seemed to generate their own light. From the cool valleys of Korea to the rising sun of Japan, and then to the warm fields of India, the silkworm traveled slowly, carried in secrecy, guarded as treasure. Each land welcomed it in its own way, weaving silk not only into cloth, but into memory and tradition. Korea was the first to receive this gift, about 200 years before the Common Era. Chinese settlers crossed the narrow waters, bringing more than just their families. In carefully tended baskets they carried silkworm eggs no larger than poppy seeds. Mulberry saplings with roots wrapped in damp cloth. And most precious of all, the knowledge passed down through generations. How to tend the tiny creatures, how to harvest their cocoons at just the right moment, how to draw from each one a single thread that might stretch for nearly a mile. Korean valleys soon echoed with the gentle sounds of sericulture, the rustle of mulberry leaves being gathered. The whispered conversations of women sorting cocoons by size and quality. The rhythmic motion of reeling wheels drawing silk threads so fine they seemed like captured starlight. Small workshops appeared in remote valleys, where families learned the patient rhythm that governed everything, from planting mulberry trees in spring to harvesting cocoons in summer's heat. Japan's turn came later, around 300 years of the Common Era. According to the Nihongi, Japan's ancient historical chronicle, 4 young Chinese women made the dangerous journey across the sea. They carried with them silkworm eggs and mulberry seeds, but also something equally valuable, the cultural understanding that made silk production possible. These women knew not just the technical steps but the seasonal rhythms, the traditional songs that marked the different stages of work, the ceremonies that blessed each harvest. They taught the arts of plain and figured weaving, establishing the foundation for what would become Japan's sophisticated silk industry. India's story unfolds differently, more complex and layered. The warm fields and monsoon rains of the subcontinent may have known some form of silk production as early as 2,400 years before the Common Era. using wild varieties that lived in forestries. But the true art of sericulture, the careful domestication of Bombyx mori, the cultivation of mulberry orchards, the precise techniques of Chinese masters, appears to have arrived around 300 years of the Common Era. This knowledge likely traveled through Buddhist monastery networks that connected distant lands like a web of spiritual purpose. Monks and pilgrims moved freely across the vast distances between Chinese and Indian sacred sites. In their simple traveling bags, alongside sacred texts written on palm leaves and religious artifacts carved from precious woods, they carried seeds and eggs, and the precious knowledge of how to transform them into threads of impossible beauty. The Buddhist connection proved crucial for silk's westward expansion. Buddhist monasteries served as centers of learning and technological exchange throughout Asia. Monks traveled freely across political boundaries that restricted merchants and diplomats, Chinese Buddhist pilgrims visiting Indian holy sites, Indian monks studying in Chinese monasteries. These created informal networks for sharing knowledge about everything from philosophy to agriculture, including sericulture. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean world, silk had become the ultimate luxury import. The first documented appearance of Chinese silk in the Roman Empire dates to the 1st century before the Common Era. Merchants following the newly established Silk Road began bringing small quantities of this mysterious fabric to Damascus and other Levantine trading centers. The reaction was immediate fascination. Roman observers struggled to describe what they were seeing. The historian Pliny the Elder wrote extensively about silk, describing it as coming from the Ceres, literally silk people, who lived somewhere in the far reaches of Asia. He noted that silk was so light that garments made from it seemed to float around the wearer, yet it was so strong that silk cords were used for military purposes. However, Pliny also expressed concern about silk's cost. He calculated that silk imports were draining the Roman treasury of precious metals at an alarming rate. The Roman Senate, that bastion of traditional republican virtue, repeatedly attempted to ban or restrict silk consumption, particularly among men. Senatorial decrees proclaimed silk wearing too decadent for Roman citizens. Such oriental luxury, they argued, corrupted traditional Roman values. Yet these laws proved largely ineffective. The demand for silk continued to grow among both the imperial court and the broader aristocracy. The cultural impact of silk extended far beyond mere fashion. Roman silk garments became markers of social status. When the emperor appeared in public wearing silk robes, the visual message was unmistakable. Here was wealth and power beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. Roman ambassadors presented silk gifts to barbarian chieftains, demonstrating the empire's access to the luxury goods of distant civilizations. Early Christian communities began using silk for religious vestments and altar hangings, elevating their worship with materials of almost supernatural beauty. The Silk Road that carried these precious textiles across the vast distances between China and Rome represented more than a trade route. It was a cultural transmission network that connected civilizations and transformed societies. Silk moved westward in carefully guarded caravans, passing through the hands of Sogdian merchants who served as intermediaries between Chinese producers and Western consumers. These remarkable traders, based in the oasis cities of Central Asia, developed specialized knowledge that made them indispensable to the international luxury trade. They could evaluate silk quality with a touch. They understood market preferences across thousands of miles. They knew which colors sold best in which cities, which weaves commanded premium prices, which patterns appealed to different cultural tastes. Recent archaeological discoveries have provided remarkable insights into how this trade actually functioned. The Sogdian letters discovered at Turfan, written in the early 4th century of the Common Era, offer first-hand accounts of silk merchants conducting business across thousands of miles. These documents, preserved by the dry desert climate, describe specific silk shipments, quality assessments made by experienced hands, market conditions in distant cities, payment arrangements that spanned years and continents. One particularly fascinating letter describes a Sogdian merchant's evaluation of different silk varieties available in Chinese markets. He notes that silk from certain regions commanded premium prices due to superior fiber quality. Silk from other areas was suitable only for specific applications. His detailed technical descriptions discuss thread count, weave patterns, and dyeing quality. They demonstrate the sophisticated knowledge required to succeed in the international silk trade. The Persian Empire occupied a crucial position in this transcontinental commerce, both as a major consumer of silk and as the primary intermediary between Chinese producers and Roman buyers. Persian silk workshops, particularly those established during the Sassanid period, developed distinctive techniques. They would unravel Chinese silk fabrics and reweave them into Persian patterns and designs. When Darius III, the last Achaemenid king, surrendered to Alexander the Great, contemporary accounts describe him as clothed in silk of such splendor that it overshadowed even Alexander's golden armor. Persian control of the silk trade created both opportunities and frustrations for the Roman Empire. Persian merchants provided reliable access to Chinese luxury goods, not only silk but also spices that burned like fire on the tongue, precious stones that captured light like frozen rainbows, exotic manufactured items that demonstrated the skill of distant craftsmen. But this dependence meant that Roman gold flowed steadily eastward, enriching Persia at Rome's expense. During periods of Roman-Persian warfare, silk supplies could be completely cut off. These shortages affected everything from imperial ceremonies to religious observances. This economic vulnerability explains Emperor Justinian's immediate interest when the 2 Nestorian monks approached him with their extraordinary proposal. The prospect of breaking the ancient monopoly represented both economic opportunity and strategic advantage. If Byzantium could produce its own silk, it would not only save the enormous costs of imports, but could potentially become an exporter itself. The flow of gold could be reversed. Commercial leverage could be gained over neighboring empires. The monks' plan exploited the one weakness in China's elaborate security system: the freedom of movement enjoyed by religious pilgrims. As Nestorian Christians, they could travel freely among the Christian communities that had somehow established themselves throughout China and Central Asia. These communities, while small, enjoyed a degree of protection and autonomy that allowed them to engage in activities that would have been impossible for secular foreigners. The historical account provided by the Byzantine historian Procopius offers remarkable detail about what happened next. The monks spent several months in careful preparation. They studied the seasonal cycles of silkworm breeding. They identified the most suitable varieties for transportation. They learned the complex techniques required to maintain silkworm eggs during a journey that would last many months. A story is told of two monks, weary from their journey, carrying nothing but plain bamboo canes. Inside those hollow stems, however, lay a secret: the tiny, fragile eggs of silkworms. At the command of Emperor Justinian, the mystery of silk was carried west, forever changing the fate of Byzantium. These were not ordinary religious pilgrims, though they appeared so to the Chinese border guards, who examined their simple possessions. The elder monk's walking stick bore the wear marks of thousands of miles of travel. The younger carried prayer beads carved from common wood. Their robes were patched and faded, speaking of years spent in distant monasteries. Nothing about them suggested they were carrying the foundation of an empire's future prosperity. Yet hidden within the bamboo canes, sealed with beeswax against moisture and protected by layers of soft cloth, lay silkworm eggs smaller than grains of rice. Each egg contained the potential for hundreds of yards of silk thread. Together, they represented the breaking of China's ancient monopoly, a secret guarded with the vigilance of kings for nearly 3,000 years. The actual smuggling operation was a masterpiece of simple deception. The monks had spent months learning exactly which varieties of silkworm would survive the long journey west. They had studied the seasonal cycles, timing their departure to ensure the eggs would remain viable throughout the arduous trip across Central Asia. They had practiced the careful techniques of preservation, maintaining the right temperature, protecting against dampness, ensuring just enough air circulation to keep the tiny embryos alive. The return journey to Constantinople took the better part of a year, following established trade routes through mountains and deserts where temperatures could kill silkworm eggs in hours. Throughout this time, the monks maintained their disguise as simple pilgrims, while secretly tending their precious cargo. When they finally reached the imperial capital in 553 of the Common Era, they carried with them not just viable eggs, but also detailed knowledge of sericulture techniques acquired through years of patient observation. Emperor Justinian immediately recognized the historic significance of their achievement. He ordered the establishment of imperial silk workshops within the royal palace precincts. The first Byzantine silk production faced numerous challenges. The imported silkworm eggs had to be carefully nurtured through their breeding cycle, fed with mulberry leaves from trees that had been hastily planted in imperial gardens. The monks worked alongside Byzantine craftsmen, sharing their knowledge of Chinese techniques while adapting these methods to local conditions and available materials. The breakthrough came in the spring of 554. The first generation of Byzantine silkworms successfully spun their cocoons. Palace artisans, following instructions provided by the monks, carefully harvested these cocoons and began the delicate process of reeling silk thread. The resulting fiber, while not quite matching the finest Chinese silk in quality, was unmistakably genuine, the first silk ever produced outside Chinese control. Emperor Justinian's reaction to this achievement was both practical and demonstrative. He immediately ordered the expansion of silk production facilities and the training of additional craftsmen. He also mandated that the new Byzantine silk industry would be an imperial monopoly. All production would be controlled by the state. Sales would be restricted to authorized buyers. This decision ensured that the economic benefits of silk production would flow directly to the imperial treasury, while maintaining the luxury status that made silk so valuable. Within a few years, Byzantium had reduced its dependence on Persian silk imports, and begun developing its own distinctive styles and techniques. Byzantine silk workshops became renowned for their brilliant colors, achieved through innovative dyeing methods. Their intricate designs combined traditional Roman motifs with influences from across the known world. Byzantine silk also gained recognition for its use of gold thread. This technique involved wrapping extremely thin gold leaf around silk fibers to create fabrics that literally glittered in candlelight. These golden silks became particularly associated with imperial ceremonial robes and religious vestments. They created visual displays of wealth and power that impressed observers from across Europe and the Middle East. Religious communities embraced silk with particular enthusiasm. Christian churches throughout the Byzantine Empire began commissioning silk altar hangings, vestments that caught the light from stained glass windows, religious banners that transformed worship spaces into displays of otherworldly beauty. The Church of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople became particularly famous for its silk decorations. These caught and reflected light from hundreds of candles and oil lamps, creating an atmosphere that contemporary observers described as, quote, heaven on earth. The success of Byzantine sericulture also catalyzed further expansion of silk production throughout the Mediterranean region. Roger II of Sicily, recognizing the economic potential, imported skilled silk weavers from Constantinople to Palermo in the 12th century. These craftsmen established workshops that became the foundation of Italy's silk industry, an industry that would eventually challenge even Chinese production in terms of quality and innovation. Italian silk production emerged during a period when Europe was experiencing unprecedented economic growth. The Crusades had opened new trade routes and created new markets for luxury goods. The rise of merchant cities like Venice, Genoa, and Florence provided the capital and commercial networks necessary for large-scale silk production. Venice, with its extensive maritime trading network, became particularly important in the silk trade. Venetian merchants could import raw silk from Byzantium or even China, process it in local workshops, export finished products throughout Europe. The city's Silk Guild, established in the 13th century, developed quality standards and training programs that made Venetian silk synonymous with excellence throughout the Mediterranean world. Florence took a different approach, focusing on innovation in weaving techniques and design. Florentine silk workshops pioneered new methods for creating complex patterns. They developed draw looms that could produce designs of unprecedented intricacy. The famous Medici family, whose wealth was built on banking and trade, became major patrons of silk production. They commissioned fabrics for their own use and as diplomatic gifts to other European rulers. The expansion of European silk production coincided with broader changes in medieval society and culture. Silk's availability, though still limited and expensive, allowed for new forms of artistic expression and social display. Gothic cathedrals began featuring silk altar hangings and vestments that complemented their soaring architecture. Royal courts developed elaborate ceremonial costumes that used silk to communicate political messages and cultural sophistication. The spread of sericulture demonstrated that even the most closely guarded technological secrets could eventually be shared, adapted, and improved upon. The ancient monopoly was broken not through conquest or theft, but through the patient work of individuals who understood both the technical requirements and the cultural contexts necessary for successful technology transfer. The story of silk's westward journey also reveals the crucial role played by religious and cultural networks in facilitating technological diffusion. Buddhist monasteries, Christian missions, and Islamic scholarly institutions all contributed to the spread of knowledge about sericulture. These connections often proved more effective than commercial or political relationships in sharing complex technologies. Each region that adopted silk production developed its own distinctive techniques, patterns, and cultural associations. China continued to evolve and maintain its reputation for exceptional quality. Chinese silk workshops developed ever more sophisticated techniques for breeding silkworms, processing cocoons, and creating finished fabrics. The Tang dynasty became particularly famous for silk products that combined traditional Chinese aesthetics with influences from across the Silk Road. These designs reflected the cosmopolitan character of Chinese civilization during its golden age. In Islamic societies, silk became associated with paradise. Quranic descriptions of heaven frequently mention silk garments as rewards for the faithful. Islamic workshops developed distinctive geometric patterns and calligraphic designs that transformed silk into vehicles for religious expression. The famous silk carpets of Persia and Central Asia represented fusion of practical craftsmanship with spiritual symbolism. In Christian Europe, silk's association with luxury and beauty made it a natural choice for religious art and ceremony. Medieval illuminated manuscripts frequently depict religious figures wearing silk robes. Actual silk vestments from this period demonstrate extraordinary skill in both weaving and embroidery. The Shroud of Turin, regardless of its ultimate authenticity, reflects the medieval association of silk with sacred purposes and divine presence. The global silk trade that emerged from these diverse production centers created commercial networks of unprecedented complexity and geographical scope. Merchants specializing in silk developed sophisticated understanding of international markets, cultural preferences, and logistical challenges. They created trading partnerships that spanned continents, financial instruments that facilitated long-distance commerce, information networks that tracked everything from weather conditions to political developments across Eurasia. Valencia's Silk Exchange, constructed between 1482 and 1522, exemplifies the institutional sophistication that the silk trade had achieved by the late medieval period. This magnificent building, known as La Lonja de la Seda, served as both marketplace and commercial court. Here, silk merchants from across the Mediterranean world could conduct business under established legal frameworks and quality standards. The building itself reflects silk's cultural importance during this period. Its Gothic architecture incorporates elements that celebrate commerce while acknowledging the divine source of prosperity. Twisted columns represent the silk threads that created the wealth necessary to construct such magnificent buildings. Carved inscriptions offer moral guidance about honest dealing and fair prices. The very stones seem to whisper stories of the merchants who gathered here, examining bolts of silk from distant lands, negotiating prices that would affect markets from Spain to China. The Silk Exchange also functioned as an information center. Here, merchants could learn about market conditions in distant cities, political developments that might affect trade routes, technological innovations that could change production methods, news from China about new weaving techniques, reports from India about monsoon conditions affecting mulberry cultivation, updates from Constantinople about Byzantine regulations. All of this information influenced pricing and planning decisions made in Valencia's silk markets. As we reflect on silk's journey from Chinese imperial workshops to global commodity, we see more than just the spread of a production technique. The story of silk reveals how human creativity, commercial ambition, and cultural exchange can transform both materials and societies. The impossible fineness of silk thread, no thicker than spider's web, yet stronger than iron wire. The lustrous beauty of silk fabric that seems to hold light within its very fibers. The complex knowledge required for silk production, passed down through generations of patient craftsmen. All of these combined to create something that transcended mere utility. Silk became a medium through which civilizations communicated their highest aspirations, for beauty that lifts the human spirit, for craftsmanship that honors the divine gift of skilled hands, for connection with the sacred through materials of otherworldly perfection, for participation in the broader human community that spans oceans and centuries. The Chinese empress, who first unwound a cocoon in her teacup, could not have imagined that her discovery would eventually connect the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic, would inspire the construction of cities and the establishment of empires, would carry religious ideas across continents and create artistic traditions that endure to this day. Yet perhaps this is always how the greatest discoveries work, beginning with simple curiosity, growing through patient effort, spreading through the irrepressible human desire to share beauty with others. The most remarkable aspect of silk's story may be how it demonstrates the ultimate impossibility of keeping valuable knowledge secret forever, despite imperial decrees that threatened death to those who revealed the secrets. Despite 3 millennia of careful control, despite guards and borders and the vast distances that separated civilizations, the secrets of sericulture eventually spread throughout the world. The 2 monks who smuggled silkworm eggs in their walking sticks were merely the agents of a deeper historical force, the human desire to share, to learn, to improve, and to create beauty that transcends the boundaries of any single culture or civilization. Silk may have gleamed brightest among all the treasures that crossed continents, but it did not travel alone. Spices carried fragrance across oceans, the warm sweetness of cinnamon, the sharp fire of pepper, the golden luxury of saffron. Incense spoke in smoke that rose from Roman altars and Chinese temples alike. Gemstones glowed with captured light, sapphires blue as midnight sky, rubies red as dragon's blood, emeralds green as spring meadows. Together with silk, they formed a fabric of desire and wonder, one that bound empires and peoples into a shared human story. The fabric of commerce that these ancient networks created was woven from more than just threads of protein fiber or bags of precious spices. It was woven from human curiosity that cannot be contained by borders or barriers. Commercial ambition that drives people to cross deserts and climb mountains in pursuit of beauty and profit. Cultural exchange that transforms strangers into partners, enemies into allies, isolated communities into participants in a global conversation. And the endless quest for beauty that seems to define our species at its most noble, the desire to surround ourselves with objects that lift the spirit, please the senses, and connect us to the wider world of human creativity. In tracing silk's journey across the world, alongside its companion treasures of spice and stone and incense, we trace our own journey toward the interconnected global civilization that would eventually emerge from these ancient networks of trade, knowledge, and mutual wonder. The Chinese empress who first unwound a cocoon in her teacup the Roman senator who first felt silk against his skin, the Byzantine monk who carried silkworm eggs in a hollow cane, the Sogdian merchant who could judge silk quality with a single touch. All were participants in a story larger than any of them could have imagined. A story of how human ingenuity and desire can transform simple materials into bonds that connect civilizations across space and time.